Today's daf yomi is Nazir daf mem hey Nazir daf mem vav Nazir 46. Today's daf yomi we're going to start at the bottom of mem hey mem beis at the Mishnah. Let's say the Nazir, after he completes his Nazirus, he has to bring 3 karbanos. So we had said that he waits till the end of his 30 days. Then he brings 3 karbanos, the ola, the chatas, and the shlamim. So he cooks the shlamim. O shalkan. Shalkan, the Mefarish says shalkan is it's she'enu mevushal yafa, that it's not cooked well. But Tosfos says it means the opposite. Bishal yoser midai. He cooks it too much. So it's either he overcooks it or he undercooks it. Either way is okay. HaKohen noto asazra b'shelam and ayil. The Kohen takes from the shlamim of the Nazir the zroa. The zroa is the forearm, and it's cooked. And what does he do with this? He's also taking v'chala matzah achas min asal or kik matzah achas, and he's also taking 1 matzah from each of the 2 types of matzos that are brought in a basket. But the Nazir also brings. He brings chalos matzos and rakike matzos, 10 of each. But the Kohen takes 1 of each of those matzos with the zroa b'shela, and also with the regular, the pasuk says, with the regular parts, the emurim, the chaza, tenufa of the shlamim that the Kohen regularly waves for every shlamim. The nosin al kapi Nazir, he places them on the hands of the Nazir, umenifan. And then the Kohen and the Nazir wave the parts together. And afterwards, the Nazir is allowed to drink wine and to come in contact with the dead. And that's the position of the Tanakama. On top of Memvav Amanal, for B'Shimon Omer, Kivin Shenizrak Alav Echam and Adamim, B'Shimon says, you don't need to go to actually first wave the parts. But even prior to that, once the blood of one of the karbanos, the oel chatos or the shamim, has been sprinkled, utar nazir or lishtos biyayin or tamil mason. Once the blood of one of the parts has been sprinkled, the nazir is going to be allowed to drink the wine and to come in contact with the dead. The Gemara says, Tanar Rabbanan, on the Brayse quoted, V'achar yishta Nazir yayin. Afterwards, the Nazir can drink the wine. What does it mean afterwards the Nazir can drink wine? Because it says in the pasuk, Ve'nifo sama kohen, the Kohen is going to wave these parts as a tenufa of Hashem, Kodeshu la Kohen, it's Kodeshu la Kohen, Al chazat tenufa v'al shokat shuma v'achar yishta Nazir yayin. It's Kodesh, and afterwards, the Nazir can drink wine. So what does it mean, says the Brayse of Achar Yishtan Nazir Yayin? Achar Maisim Kuan. After he does all the actions, after he brings the sacrifices, slaughters the animals, sprinkles their blood, waves the parts of the animals that are supposed to be waved, cooks the parts, then waves the parts. Then, after that, the Nazir can drink the wine. That's the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Chachamim Omrim says, the Mefarish explains, what does it mean, Achar Ma'asim Kuhan? After the carbon and after the haircut. So that's what's required. The Chachamim Omrim, Achar Ma'aseh Yachidi. And the Chachamim say, after one single act. He just has to do one act. The Mefarish explains, after the carbon, even though he still hasn't got his haircut, that the haircut is not essential. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying that the haircut is essential. So again, Rabbi Eliezer says you have to do it after all of the actions, and the Chachamim say after one of the actions. Excuse me, my taimayo de Rabbanan. What's the reason why the Rabbanan say after? What's the reason why the Rabbanan say after all of the action, after one of the actions? Meaning to say, after even sprinkling one of the blood, just one of the bloods of the animals, my tamad rabbanan, because ksiv halcha, because it says over here in this pasuk, v'achar yishteh a nazir yayin. It says here, afterwards the Nazir will drink wine. V'ksiv hasam, and it says in the previous pasuk, achar hitkalcho es nizro. It says in that pasuk, the Kohen should take the zroa b'shela, mina ayel, he should take the cooked forearm from the ram, chalos matzachas min asal, or kik matzachas, and place it on the hands of the Nazir, achar hitkalcho es nizro, after he has cut off the hair from his head. So ma hasam, just like over there, is achar ma'asi achid. He was after one action. Which action? The action of waving. Then after the action of waving, he can cut. After he cuts his hair, he can wave the animals. And so too, afkan achar ma'asi achid. So too, in this case, when can he drink the wine? After he does one action, either the sprinkling of the blood, It doesn't have to be done after everything. So the Gemara says, well, maybe it's after he does both of them. Maybe it means achar means after he does the karbanos and the haircut, and the achar teglachato means after he does all the avodas of the karbanos. That's how Tosfos explains it. So the Gemara says, no. If that's the case, what would the Gzera Shava be? What would the Gzera Shava be adding to the discussion? Because we wouldn't be learning anything from it, because that's what the pasuk means. Achar yishta nazir yain seems to be after you do the actions that were mentioned, and so therefore the Gzera Shava is extra. So therefore the Chachamim are saying that is teaching us that after you do one action is sufficient. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Amar Rav. Rav comes along and tells us, Tenufa ben Nazir ma'akeves, that if you do not wave if the Kohen and the Nazir, if the Kohen doesn't put the parts on the Nazir's hands and wave them, then it's not going to be permitted for the Nazir to ever drink the wine and come in contact with the dead. That it's, well, Mefarsh says to come and drink the wine and come in contact with the dead. Tosfos says just to drink the wine. So that's what Rav says. Tenufa ben Nazir is ma'akeves, that it's essential. It's, if you can, we'll just stick with drinking the wine so we don't make it too complicated. And if you don't do the waving, Rav says you can't drink the wine. Aliba demand. So according to whom? Do we say Aliba de Rabbanan? The Rabbanan's position again was that you just have to do one action. After one action, you're allowed. If you sprinkle the blood, you're allowed to drink the wine. And Rabbi Eliezer says you have to do all the action, the carbon and the haircuts. So do we say Aliba Deman, according to whom? You aim Aliba de Rabbanan. If you want to say it's according to the Rabbanan, who say it's only after one action, just after the sprinkling of the blood is sufficient. If you want to say it's just according to the Rabbanan, the rabbis say you don't even require the haircut in order to drink the wine. Are you going to require the waving? So it must be Aliba de Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that what? The Rabbi Eliezer says that you need to do all of the actions before you can drink the wine. You need to bring the carbon and get a haircut and then do the waving. So you want to say, according to the Rabbanan, if you want to say according to Rabbi Eliezer, Pshita, it's obvious. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Achar Ma'asim Kulam. It's after all the actions. So clearly, Rabbi Eliezer would say that the tenufa is required. Now, Mao de Tema, you might have said, Kivin Inyan Kapara, Shiari Mitzvah. You might have said, well, since with respect to the carbon, since with respect to the atonement, it's just a Shiari Mitzvah. The waving is just a Shiari Mitzvah. It's not a requirement. You might have thought it's not a requirement to drink the wine. The actual waving is not a requirement. Kamashwan, it is. Let's look at what the Mefarish says here. He says, what does it mean that Inyan Kapara Shiari Mitzvah? That with respect to atonement, the waving is a Shiari Mitzvah. The Amar Mar with Tenufa Lechaper, that you're supposed to wave in order for it to achieve an atonement. The Tenufa Mechaperis, Mefarish is citing the Gemara in Yom Adaf Hey. Does the waving actually serve as an atonement? It's the blood that serves as an atonement. The blood and the soul serve an atonement. So it's to tell you, Shem, Shiari Mitzvah, Mala Kosov Ki'u Lo Chiper, V'Chiper. Kabi Nazir Nami, Lo Ma'akev. So so it's to tell us that if you, that if you make the tenufa like a shiari mitzvah, if you make it just like a remnant, it's as though you did not achieve an atonement at all. So therefore, we should say by the Nazir, it should not be required. So that's what the Mefarish is saying. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to read what Tosfos says here also. Tosfos says this shiari mitzvah gedama parakama tizvacham shem also tenufa shiari mitzvah kolmar shalo also, that if you didn't do the tenufa, you treat it as a shiari mitzvah. Arei ki'ilu kiper shelo kiyam mitzvah min hamufkar. You did not fulfill the mitzvah properly. V'chiper, but you still achieved atonement. The ema akaves, that it's not essential. So you might have thought here also that since with respect to kapara, it's just a shiari mitzvah, it's not required. Kamashwa, no, it is required. So that's what the Gemara is saying. And when Rav says tenufa benazir is required, that the waving by a nazir is required, Rav is saying that even though it's a shiari mitzvah, we're nevertheless going to say that you cannot drink the wine until you've done the waving. So the Gemara says, but wait, we're on top of Mem Vav on the base. Is the waving of these parts really required? Vatanya zos taras a Nazir. This is the law of the Nazir, bein sheyesh lo kapayim, bein she'en lo kapayim, that the Nazir is required to wave the parts of the animal, whether he has hands or whether he doesn't. And it means that even if he doesn't have the hands, it's a requirement. So the Gemara says, at first glance, the Gemara assumes that what's the Bryce is saying. That just like a Nazir who doesn't have hands is not required to wave, so too even a Nazir who has hands is not required to wave. So we see from here that the waving is not a requirement. Ella Hadatanya. So the Gemara says, but it can't be that that's the way we read it, because we also say in the Brisa, Zos Tarasa Nazir, Bein Sheyeshlo Seir, Bein She'enlo Seir. This is the law of the Nazir. He has to cut his hair, whether he has hair and whether he doesn't have hair. Meaning to say, Bein Sheyeshlo Seir, Bein She'enlo Seir. That's the same law. And according to you, who says that if he doesn't have hands, he doesn't have to wave it. Would you mean to say, so that the waving is not required? Would you say that also the cutting of the hair is not required? Hachinami du'ama. You want to say that the cutting of the hair is not required. But Tanya, we learned Nazir Memora. Let's say the Nazir is bald. Beis Shammai says, Eino tzarach avir tavir alo sho. Beis Shammai says he does not need to cut his hair with a razor if he's bald. Beis Hillel tzarach avir alo sho. Beis Hillel says he is required. Amar Rachmana ma eino tzarach. Amar Ravina says when Beis Shammai says that you don't need to, Eino tzarach, Eino takana, means you have no ability to do it. Alo Beis Hillel yesh lo takana. So, but according to Beis Hillel, you have a takana. And what is it? What is that takana? You have to bring the razor on your hair. Meaning to say that you need to bring the razor on your hair to fulfill the mitzvah. And so we say that you can't say that the earlier brisa means to say that the earlier brisa is coming to tell us that somebody who has hair is like somebody who has no hair, and to say that it's not required. But rather, the brisa is saying that somebody who has no hair is compared to somebody who has hair, and to say that also the person who's bald is obligated to put the razor on his head, and that's like Beis Hillel. And from here we see that that's how we explain the first brisa. That what's the first brisa? That the first brisa is saying that somebody who has no hands is supposed to wave the zroa b'shela like somebody who has hands, and so therefore, since he can't wave it, he uses a different part of his body to wave it, and so therefore we're going to say it's not difficult for Rav because the Bryce is not saying that the waving is not a requirement, and the Gemara is telling us this position that Beis Shammai says that if you have no hair, you have no takana. This position of Beis Shammai is like the position of Rabbi Pedas. V'ayinu de Rabbi Pedas, Amar Rabbi Pedas. Beis Shammai and Rabbi Elazar Amru Davar Achad. Beis Shammai says the same thing as Rabbi Elazar. That what does Rabbi Elazar say? The Tanya, we're talking about a mitzora here. We know that the mitzora, as part of their purification process, that the Kohen is supposed to put the blood on his different parts of his body, on the right thumb, the right ear, and the right big toe. But let's say he doesn't have these parts. Engo tahara olam estivi Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, like Beis Shammai, if he doesn't have these parts, he puts it, he can't get cured. He can't get cured from his saras. Rabbi Shimon Omer Yanichenu Amakomo V'Yatza. Now Rabbi Shimon says, just put it on the place where it was, and that's sufficient. Chamim Omer Yaniach al Shal Smol V'Yatza. Chamim say, put it on his left hand if he fulfills his obligation. So the position of Beis Shammai is consistent with the position of Rabbi Eliezer. And if he has no parts of his body, if he's missing that part of the body, he has nothing he can do. But Beis Hillel and Rabbi Shimon are saying, yeah, you could put it on the place where it was. You can substitute. So Lishnach Amarav. So there's an alternative version of this discussion that Rav taught to Nufa ben Nazir Ma'akeves, that the waving by a Nazir is essential. Aliba Daman, according to whom? Aliba de Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you do it after all of the actions. Well, that's obvious. Pshita, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Achar Ma'asim Kum. It's obvious. Aliba de Rabbanan. You want to say the Rabbanan after according to the Rabbanan who say that only after one of the actions you wave, meaning to say that even if you sprinkle just the bloods of one of the animals. So you want to say, according to the Rabbanan, the waving is required. The Rabbanan are of the position that tiglachas, that even if you don't take the haircut, it's not a requirement and you're allowed to drink the wine. Tunufamibai, for sure the waving is not a requirement. The Gemara then asks, according to the Rabbanan, Milo Ma'akfa, and is it really the case that according to the Rabbanan, the waving is not a requirement? But Tanya, Zos Torah Nazir, Ben Sheyeshel Kapayim, Ben She'enlo Kapayim. This is the law of the Nazir. He has to wave whether or not he has hands or not. Tanya, Zos Torah Nazir, Ben Sheyeshel Ser, Ben She'enlo Ser. This is the law of the Nazir, whether he has hair or whether he doesn't have hair. Would you say that even if he doesn't have hair, you can't drink the wine? Beis Shammai says he doesn't need to bring the razor on his head. So we see that the hair, we see from here that Beis Hillel still says you need to bring the razor on your head. And Amar Avina, my tzarach Beis Hillel, tzarach ve'en takana. So we see that Beis Hillel says tzarach ve'en lo takana, while Beis Shammai yesh lo takana. And Beis Shammai says you have a takana, that you don't need to do it. That's what Beis Shammai is saying, that you need to just bring the razor on his head, even though he's not doing anything. And this position says that Rabbi Avina is arguing on the Rabbi Padas. Because according to this position, Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer are saying the same thing. What are they saying? They're saying that you do have a takana. That according to this position, Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer, we're saying that Rabbi Avina is arguing with Rabbi Padas, because Rabbi Padas said that Beis Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer said the same thing, that he has no takana. But according to this position, Beis Shammai is saying that he has a takana. What's a takana? Bring the razor on his head, which is like the position that we saw earlier of Beis Hillel. And we see from here, like according to the first shita, the shita of Rabbi Padas, that Beis Shammai is saying that if you don't have some of the physical requirements, you can't fulfill your obligation. It's just impossible. Whereas Beis Hillel is saying you could do it virtually. You could assume where that part of the body was. Beis Hillel is saying that the physicality is not going to be a barrier to your spiritual success here. So now we do the Bana Mishnah, Gilech al Zevach. Let's say you shechted the carbon, and then you discovered it was a disqualification in the one of the carbonos that the Nazir brought, Tiglachaso Pesua. So then you had brought the carbon after you cut your hair after you brought one of these carbonos, which you now discovered to be disqualified. Your haircut is disqualified. And your carbonos didn't count. So that the other carbonos that he then brought after he did his haircut don't count because he has to regrow his hair for 30 days. But let's say Gilach al Chatas Shalosh. Let's say he brought a Chatas, but he didn't bring the Chatas for properly. He brought it the wrong intent. And then he brought the right carbonos. He brought them properly. Mishman Tiglachaso Psula. Then he's also going to be disqualified because since he brought the Chatas improperly, so he and then he did his haircut, so he didn't bring any carbonos properly again. And so therefore we're going to say Zevachav Olo. So that under those circumstances, his carbon was not effective because again, he did the haircut before he brought a proper carbon. So the carbon was ineffective. So the haircut was done improperly. So he has to do a 30-day growth. So if he brought the carbonos afterwards, we're going to say those carbonos were brought when he needed to let his hair grow, so they're not going to be effective. Let's say he slaughtered the ola or the shlamim improperly. And then he brought the carbonos properly. Then we're going to say, according to Tanakama, that let's say he brought the ola or shlamim shlo, and then he brought the other carbon properly. So according to Tanakama, it's disqualified because since the first carbon was not brought for the Nazirus, so therefore he did the haircut on an adava, and it's not acceptable. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says also so Rabbi Shimon says the shlamim that carbon that he brought Shalom Shema doesn't help him for his Nazirus, but the other carbonos do because because it was proper. And the Gemara is going to discuss why. Let's say he brought all three carbonos and only one of them was kosher. It's a valid haircut. And then afterwards he brings the remaining carbonos. So Amar Rabbi Shimon must be of the position that Nazir sheg that if the Nazir just did his carbonos, he cut his hair after bringing a shalmei nedava, not specifically the shalmei for the Nazir, but just a voluntary offering, that's okay. My time. What's the reason? Because technically speaking, all the pasuk says is he placed it on the fire that's underneath the zevach hashamim. And it doesn't say below cost of al shamav. It doesn't say specifically on his carbon shalmim. And therefore, it's going to be acceptable. Okay, so we'll continue now, but I'm going to stop recording because that's the daf yomi for Friday, daf mem vav. Hold on, let me stop the recording.